Tonight, we travel back in time to a world that once existed and now only whispers. Long before memory learned how to write itself down, there was a land where life survived only by permission. A narrow ribbon of water cut through an endless body of sand. On either side of it, the desert waited, patient, silent, absolute. This was not a world that welcomed humanity. It tolerated it. And only for as long as balance was maintained. The people of ancient Egypt did not believe they lived in chaos. They believed chaos was always close, always pressing in from the horizon. Every sunrise was a fragile victory. Every harvest, a temporary reprieve. The river gave life, but it could also withhold it. The gods offered protection, but only if honored with precision. Even the dead were not at rest, unless the living remembered their names. To exist here meant to understand limit. The limit of water. The limit of flesh. The limit of time. Ancient Egypt was not merely a civilization of monuments and gold. It was a civilization built on fear, carefully disguised as order. Fear of forgetting. Fear of disorder. Fear that, without constant effort, the world would slide back into darkness. They called this balance Ma'at, truth, order, harmony. But Ma'at was not gentle. It demanded obedience. It demanded ritual. It demanded belief, repeated day after day, generation after generation, so that the sun might rise again. In this land, even eternity required maintenance. Stone was stacked not only to honor the dead, but to defy oblivion. Bodies were preserved not out of vanity, but out of terror, the terror that decay meant annihilation. Names were carved deep, because silence was the greatest death of all. Tonight, we do not walk through ancient Egypt as conquerors or scholars. We move through it slowly, as the people themselves did, aware that every step depended on forces beyond human control. We will follow the river as it breathes life into dust. We will stand beneath temples that inhaled incense and exhaled power. We will descend into tombs where darkness was designed, measured, and sealed. And as the torches dim, and the sand settles once more, we will ask the question that haunted every soul who lived beneath the Egyptian sun. Was order enough to keep the darkness away, or did it merely delay it? They called this place Kemet, the Black Land. Not because it was dark, but because it lived. Along the river, the soil was heavy and dark, soaked with the memory of floods that came and went long before names were given to gods. Here, grain could grow. Here, animals could feed. Here, people could remain. But beyond this narrow strip, the world changed abruptly. Sand replaced soil. Silence replaced birdsong. The horizon hardened into something merciless. This was Deschret, the Red Land. A place without mercy, without shade, without forgiveness. The desert did not threaten. It simply waited. Every Egyptian life unfolded between these two truths. Black earth beneath their feet, red sand always close. Children learned this before they learned words. They felt it in the way fields ended suddenly, in the way the wind sharpened when it crossed the dunes, in the way bones bleached quickly when left unburied. The river was not generous. It was precise. When it flooded at the right height, life expanded. When it rose too little, hunger crept in quietly. When it rose too high, homes dissolved, and order fractured. Between abundance and disaster, there was only a margin of error measured in hands. This fragile balance shaped how people thought. Nothing was permanent. Nothing was accidental. Every act mattered. How a field was measured, how a canal was cleared, how an offering was placed before a god. To neglect these duties was not laziness. It was dangerous. Because chaos did not announce itself. It seeped in, quietly, like sand through a doorway left unsealed. The desert was not empty to them. It was full of warning. Here lay abandoned tools, half buried. Here stood broken markers, names erased by wind. Here were the paths of traders who never returned. And yet, the desert also preserved. Bodies left to the sand dried slowly, naturally, their forms held intact long after breath had vanished. The people noticed this. They remembered it. Death behaved differently here. In the Black Land, decay was quick, soft soil consuming flesh. In the Red Land, the dead endured. This contrast did not go unanswered. It shaped belief. It shaped ritual. It shaped the architecture of eternity. To live near the river was to borrow time. To die in the desert was to confront forever. So they built their homes close to water, and their tombs closer to sand. Each morning, as the sun lifted itself over the eastern horizon, light spilled across fields and stone, revealing once more how narrow the world truly was. Life existed here, but only within boundaries. And beyond those boundaries, the red land watched, unchanged, unforgiving, and eternal. Before the sun revealed itself, the river was already awake. Mist hovered just above the water, thin, pale, unsettled. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth, reeds, and decay held in balance. This was the hour when Egypt breathed quietly. Along the banks, shadows moved without sound. Feet pressed into damp soil, leaving impressions that would not last past midday. Men and women rose before light, not out of devotion, but necessity. The river did not wait. Boats slid into the water, papyrus hulls whispering against the current. Nets were checked, repaired, knotted again with practiced hands. Fish flickered beneath the surface, unseen, but expected. Children slept nearby, curled close to walls that still held the night's coolness. Soon, they would wake, and the day would begin its slow demands. Fires were coaxed back to life. Ash stirred, embers breathed, flames returned quietly. Bread dough rested in bowls, its future already decided. Nothing here was rushed. Speed wasted energy, and energy was survival. The first light crept across the water, turning ripples into dull bronze. Palm silhouettes sharpened, then softened again as the sun hesitated. This moment mattered. If the sun rose, order had held. Every dawn confirmed that Ma'at still endured, that the gods had not turned away during the night. People paused, not in prayer, but in recognition. Fields waited beyond the riverbank. Canals cut carefully through soil, guiding water like veins beneath skin. Each channel had been cleared by hand, maintained by memory, and watched closely. If one failed, the land would remember. Birds stirred, lifting from reeds in sudden bursts of sound. Their cries marked the true beginning of morning. Now, the river reflected the sky completely. Blue replaced gray, and the heat began its slow return. Tools were lifted, shouldered, accepted. Wood, stone, fiber, and muscle. No one spoke of the desert at this hour. But it was there, just beyond sight, waiting. As the sun finally cleared the horizon, light flooded the black land once more. — Another day had been granted. 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 — Another day had Another fragile balance maintained. And the river flowed on, indifferent, eternal, carrying life forward, one morning at a time. Ma'at was not imagined as an abstract philosophy. It was understood as something practical and necessary, a force that shaped daily life as surely as the river shaped the land. For the people of ancient Egypt, order was not an idea to debate but a condition to survive. Without it, the world they depended on could not hold together. Nothing around them felt naturally stable. The Nile could rise too little or too much. The harvest could fail without warning. Illness could arrive suddenly, and the desert was always close. Ma'at explained why existence continued at all. It was the belief that the universe possessed a fragile balance and that human behavior played a direct role in preserving or damaging it. This balance did not maintain itself automatically. It required constant attention. When water was distributed unfairly, fields suffered. When measurements were altered, trust dissolved. When rituals were neglected, fear followed. Events were rarely seen as random. Misfortune suggested that order had been disturbed. Ma'at governed how land was measured after the floodwaters receded. It shaped how grain was counted, taxed, and stored. It determined how disputes were settled and how authority was exercised. Truth, in this world, was not emotional. It was proportional. A judgment was considered just if it restored balance. Punishment existed not to express anger but to correct imbalance. To violate Ma'at was not framed as disobedience against a ruler. It was understood as damage to the structure of existence itself. From an early age, people learned how to remain within boundaries. Excess was dangerous. Neglect was worse. The ideal life was one that fit smoothly into the expected pattern, leaving no disruption behind. This expectation extended through every layer of society. Officials were valued for reliability rather than innovation. Scribes were trusted for precision rather than creativity. Priests were respected for consistency rather than revelation. Repeating a ritual correctly mattered more than understanding it fully. Accuracy preserved order. Deviation invited uncertainty. Ma'at also shaped how time itself was understood. The past was not something to overcome but something to preserve. Stability carried greater value than change. This is why traditions endured for centuries with little alteration. Architecture followed familiar forms. Religious imagery repeated established gestures. Texts echoed older language. Continuity was proof that order still held. Yet Ma'at was fragile, not because it was gentle, but because it depended on effort. The universe did not correct itself. If humans failed in their responsibilities, disorder followed. This belief placed immense weight on authority. The pharaoh was not merely a political leader. He was regarded as the primary human agent responsible for maintaining Ma'at on a cosmic scale. If the harvest failed, it reflected on him. If unrest spread, it reflected on him. If divine favor seemed absent, it reflected on him. This is why royal imagery emphasized stillness and permanence. Movement suggested instability. Stillness suggested control. Through the king, order was believed to flow into the world. Through ritual, balance was renewed. Through survival, continuity was preserved. But responsibility did not end at the throne. Every individual was expected to maintain order within their own domain. Honesty in trade mattered. Moderation in speech mattered. Respect for hierarchy mattered. The moral system of ancient Egypt focused on consequence rather than internal guilt. Actions mattered because they produced imbalance, not because they violated personal emotion. This is why Ma'at appears so prominently in funerary texts. The dead were judged not by belief but by alignment. The heart was weighed against order itself. A life that fit cleanly into the structure of the world was considered successful. A life that disrupted it was dangerous. Ma'at promised continuity, but only through discipline. Freedom was not celebrated. Stability was. This worldview produced a civilization that valued endurance over change and memory over progress. And for centuries it worked. Yet fear remained beneath the surface. Fear that the river would fail. Fear that the gods would withdraw. Fear that chaos, once admitted, would not leave again. Ma'at stood between the living world and that fear, not as comfort but as discipline. It shaped bodies, thoughts, architecture, and memory. It was order made human. The pharaoh was not understood as a man who ruled by choice. He ruled because the world required him to. In ancient Egypt, kingship was not framed as ambition or conquest. It was framed as obligation. The survival of order depended on a living figure who could act as its anchor. That figure was the king. He was not seen as divine in the way later cultures imagined God. He did not exist beyond the world. He existed at its center. The pharaoh stood between humanity and chaos, between the gods and the land, between continuity and collapse. This belief shaped every aspect of royal presence. The king was expected to embody stillness. Emotion was dangerous. Spontaneity suggested weakness. Royal imagery avoided movement for this reason. The pharaoh is shown seated, standing upright, or striding forward with controlled precision. Nothing about him appears accidental. Stillness communicated stability. If the king appeared calm, the world was calm. If he endured, the cycle endured. His body mattered. His health mattered. His survival was interpreted as evidence that Ma'at remained intact. This is why illness at court caused unease, and why succession was a matter of urgency, not politics. A broken line of kingship threatened balance itself. The pharaoh's daily duties were ritualized acts of maintenance. He did not rule primarily through speech. He ruled through repetition. Offerings were presented. Symbols were renewed. Gestures were repeated exactly as tradition demanded. Through these acts, the king reaffirmed the bond between gods and land. Even warfare was framed within this logic. Military campaigns were not justified as expansion. They were justified as restoration. Foreign lands represented disorder. To subdue them was to reassert balance. Victory was depicted not as triumph, but correction. The king's authority extended into time itself. Years were dated by his reign. History was measured through his continuity. To remember a king was to preserve order. To erase his name was to sever it. This is why damnatio memoriae was feared. Not because it removed honor, but because it threatened stability. A king without memory became a gap in the structure of time. Yet the burden of kingship was immense. The pharaoh was expected to succeed where humans naturally failed. He was expected to be eternal, while remaining mortal. This contradiction defined Egyptian kingship. Death did not end royal duty. It transformed it. The king's tomb was not merely a burial place. It was a continuation of function. Through proper burial, the pharaoh continued to uphold Ma'at from the other side of existence. If burial failed, order weakened. This is why royal funerary architecture demanded perfection. Stone replaced flesh. Monuments replaced breath. The living king prepared for death from the moment he took the throne. Not out of fear, but necessity. To rule Egypt was to accept that your body was temporary, but your function could not be. In this way, the pharaoh was both human and symbol. A man bound by flesh, and a pillar holding the world upright. As long as he stood, order stood with him. And when he fell, the land waited anxiously to see whether balance would survive the silence. In a world where order depended on memory, writing became power. Most people in ancient Egypt could not read. They did not need to. Their lives were governed by marks made by others. The scribes were those others. They were not warriors. They did not command armies or rule cities. Yet without them, nothing endured. The scribe's task was simple in description, but immense in consequence. He recorded. He measured. He preserved. Grain entering a storehouse became real only when written down. Land reclaimed after the flood existed only once its boundaries were marked in ink. A tax was owed only when it was recorded. Writing did not merely describe reality. It fixed it. This gave scribes a quiet authority. They stood close to power, but rarely embodied it. Their education was long and unforgiving. Mistakes were not tolerated, because mistakes altered order. A single incorrect sign could change ownership. A misplaced number could disrupt supply. An omitted name could erase a person from history. Scribes learned early that memory was fragile. Papyrus decayed. Ink faded. Stone endured, but only if protected. To write something was to fight forgetting. This is why writing carried moral weight. To record falsely was not simply dishonest. It was destructive. The written word extended into death. Names carved into tomb walls were not decoration. They were survival. To be remembered was to continue existing. To be forgotten was to vanish completely. Scribes understood this better than anyone. They copied funerary texts carefully, repeating phrases centuries old without alteration. Accuracy mattered more than originality. A spell that had worked before would work again. Change introduced risk. This conservatism preserved stability, but it also bound the future to the past. Writing also created distance. A peasant might never meet the official who taxed him, but he would feel the weight of that official's records. Ink traveled where authority could not. The scribe did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His work spoke long after he was gone. Through lists, inventories, and accounts, the state remained visible. Through archives, time became manageable. The past could be consulted. The present could be regulated. In this way, scribes became guardians of continuity. They ensured that Ma'at survived not only through ritual, but through memory. Without them, order would dissolve into rumor. They worked quietly, often unnoticed, surrounded by reed pens, pallets, and dust. But every mark they made carried weight. Because once something was written, it resisted disappearance. And in a civilization haunted by the fear of oblivion, that resistance mattered. Temples in ancient Egypt were not places of gathering. They were places of maintenance. Most people never entered them. They did not need to. The work done inside was not meant to be seen. A temple existed to serve the gods, not the public. It was understood as a living structure, one that required daily attention in order to function. If neglected, order weakened. At the heart of every temple stood the sanctuary. Small, dark, and deliberately closed off. Here, the god was believed to reside. Not symbolically, but physically. The statue was not decoration. It was presence. Each morning, priests entered this space in silence. They had purified themselves beforehand, washing their bodies, shaving their hair, and abstaining from excess. Cleanliness was not symbolic. It was necessary. The doors were opened carefully. Light entered slowly. The god was awakened. This act was repeated every day, exactly as it had been for generations. Variation was avoided. Precision mattered. The statue was washed, anointed, and dressed. Fresh offerings were placed before it. Food, drink, incense. The god did not eat in a human sense, but the act of offering sustained the bond between worlds. Incense filled the chamber, heavy and controlled. Scent was part of ritual. It marked the space as separate from the outside world. Beyond the sanctuary, the temple expanded in measured layers. Courtyards, halls, pylons. Each threshold marked a transition. From light to shadow. From noise to stillness. The deeper one moved, the less human the space became. These buildings were aligned with intention. Axes pointed toward sacred directions. Light entered only at specific moments. Time itself was choreographed. Festivals allowed the god to move beyond the sanctuary. The statue was carried in procession, hidden within a shrine. The people did not see the god. They saw movement. That was enough. For the priests, ritual was labor. Long, repetitive, unchanging. Its purpose was not inspiration. It was preservation. Every gesture reaffirmed order. Every correctly spoken word held the world in place. Mistakes were dangerous. Silence at the wrong moment mattered. The gods were powerful, but also dependent. Without ritual, their presence faded. Temples also functioned as economic centers. Land, livestock, and labor flowed through them. Offerings became provisions. Ritual sustained both divine and human systems. This integration reinforced stability. Religion was not separate from life. It structured it. To an outsider, the repetition might appear empty. To the Egyptians, it was necessary. The temple breathed through routine. Inhale. Ritual. Exhale. Continuity. As long as the doors opened each morning, and incense rose again, the world endured. The gods of ancient Egypt were not distant abstractions. They were explanations. They explained why the sun returned each morning, why the river flooded when it did, and why chaos never disappeared entirely but remained close, waiting beyond the edge of cultivated land. To the Egyptians, the natural world was not neutral. It was active, unpredictable, and filled with forces that exceeded human control. The gods gave these forces shape. This is why so many Egyptian deities appear as combinations of human and animal. The animal was not decoration. It was function. An animal expressed a power that humans recognized but could not dominate. The falcon saw farther than any man. The jackal moved easily between settlements and burial grounds. The crocodile controlled the riverbanks where life and death met. To assign these traits to the gods was not symbolic in a modern sense. It was descriptive. Horus, the falcon-headed god, embodied kingship and vision. From above, the falcon sees order where humans see confusion. This made Horus the natural protector of the throne. Anubis, with the head of a jackal, governed the boundary between life and death. Jackals were often seen near cemeteries, not as invaders but as quiet presences. They belonged to the edge. Sobuk, the crocodile god, represented the dangerous fertility of the Nile. The river gave life, but it could also kill without warning. Sobuk embodied that contradiction. These gods were not moral in the way later religions imagined divinity. They did not reward virtue or punish sin consistently. They behaved like the forces they represented. Predictable at times, violent at others. The Egyptian pantheon was not organized around belief alone. It was organized around function. Every god had a role to play in maintaining Ma'at. No single deity controlled everything. Balance depended on cooperation. This is why Egyptian religion appears complex and overlapping. Multiple gods could govern the same domain without contradiction. Life itself was layered. The sun, for example, was not explained by a single god. Ra represented its visible power. Adam embodied its creative potential. Khepri, shown as a scarab, symbolized its rebirth each morning. The scarab was not chosen arbitrarily. Egyptians observed how dung beetles rolled spheres across the ground, from which new life appeared to emerge. This behavior mirrored the sun's daily journey across the sky. Observation shaped theology. These gods were not distant. They were present in temples, in names, in household shrines, and in official language. Their images appeared on walls, amulets, and coffins. To invoke a god was to invoke a specific force. Protection, fertility, stability. Religion functioned as a system of risk management. By honoring the gods correctly, people hoped to align themselves with forces that could not be controlled directly. Fear was never absent from this system. The gods could withdraw their favor. They could remain silent. Natural disasters were interpreted not as random events but as signs that balance had been disturbed. This made ritual repetition essential. To repeat what had worked before was safer than innovation. The gods were also deeply tied to place. Many were associated with specific cities or regions. This localized worship reinforced political structure. When a city rose in importance, its god often rose with it. When power shifted, theology adjusted. This adaptability allowed Egyptian religion to endure for millennia. New gods could be absorbed. Old gods could be reinterpreted. Contradiction was tolerated. Stability mattered more than consistency. The gods were not expected to make sense in a philosophical way. They were expected to work. Even death did not sever the relationship between humans and God. Funerary texts called upon them as guides, judges, and protectors. The afterlife was not guaranteed. It had to be navigated. Gods with animal faces stood along that path as familiar markers in an unfamiliar realm. They represented forces the dead had encountered in life. This familiarity reduced fear. Not by removing danger, but by naming it. To give a force a name was to make it manageable. To give it a face was to make it recognizable. In this way, Egyptian gods did not distance humans from nature. They bound them to it. The gods were not above the world. They were woven into it. As long as animals moved, the river flowed, and the sun rose, the gods remained present. And as long as the gods remained present, Ma'at could endure. The Nile formed the physical and psychological center of ancient Egyptian life, but it was never regarded as a benevolent presence that could be trusted without reservation. Dependence on the river produced caution rather than comfort, because every aspect of survival was tied to forces that remained beyond human control, no matter how carefully they were observed or ritualized. The annual inundation structured the Egyptian understanding of time more deeply than any calendar. Years were not remembered primarily by political events or personal milestones, but by the quality of the flood and the consequences that followed from it. A successful year was one in which the water arrived at the expected moment, reached an acceptable height, and withdrew without destroying what it had sustained. Although the flooding of the Nile was a regular phenomenon, it was never assumed to be predictable in outcome. The river rose each summer as it had done for generations, but familiarity did not remove uncertainty, because even slight deviations could determine whether a harvest would sustain the population or push it toward scarcity. If the inundation was insufficient, the silt that renewed the fields failed to reach the cultivated land, leaving soil dry and unproductive. If the water rose too high, settlements near the riverbanks were damaged, storage facilities were compromised, and labor invested over many seasons could be erased within days. Between these extremes lay a narrow range in which the flood could be considered successful, and that range could not be controlled, only measured. This necessity for measurement shaped Egyptian administration at its most fundamental level. Nilometers and flood markers recorded water levels, allowing officials to estimate future yields and adjust expectations long before the harvest season began. These observations were not abstract data but practical indicators of stability, hunger, or impending crisis. When the water receded, it left behind the black silt that gave Kemet its name. This soil was fertile but demanding, requiring consistent labor rather than innovation, and reinforcing an agricultural system based on repetition and reliability. Fields had to be re-established each year, because boundaries dissolved under the flood and returned only through renewed agreement and documentation. As a result, land ownership was never entirely fixed. It depended on memory, record-keeping, and the continued functioning of administrative structures, all of which mirrored the temporary nature of the land itself. Stability was not assumed to exist naturally but was understood as something that had to be restored repeatedly. Egyptian farming practices reflected this understanding. Techniques changed slowly not due to lack of knowledge, but because experimentation introduced risk that could not easily be corrected. A failed innovation could compromise an entire growing season, while adherence to tradition offered at least the reassurance of familiarity. The Nile also functioned as the primary artery of movement within Egypt. Travel by land was slow, physically demanding, and often dangerous, while travel by water allowed goods, officials, and materials to move with relative efficiency between distant regions. Stone for monuments, grain for storage, and personnel for administration all depended on the river's navigability. This movement reinforced political unity. The state was able to function as a connected system rather than a collection of isolated communities, because the river provided a shared route of access and control. In this way, natural geography supported centralized authority. Religious interpretation followed the same practical logic. The flood was not attributed to chance, but neither was it imagined as a reward for devotion. It was understood as the visible behavior of divine forces whose actions required careful management through ritual rather than emotional appeal. Hapi, the deity associated with inundation, embodied abundance held within limits rather than unchecked power. offerings directed toward him emphasized balance and moderation, reflecting the belief that excess was as dangerous as deprivation. The river was also inseparable from Egyptian conceptions of death. Bodies were transported across it toward burial grounds on the western bank, aligning the physical act of crossing water with the symbolic transition from life into the afterlife. The Nile thus accompanied individuals throughout their entire existence, from the sustenance of daily life to the rituals of burial. Despite its centrality, the river was never regarded as responsive to worship in a personal sense. It continued its course regardless of reverence, which is precisely why it was monitored so closely and feared so quietly. Observation, measurement, and restraint mattered more than confidence or faith. The Egyptians understood that the Nile was not a gift bestowed upon them, but a condition of existence that could sustain life for generations or withdraw without warning. That awareness shaped their economy, their religion, their administration, and their understanding of order itself. Stone became the preferred language of permanence in ancient Egypt, not because it was beautiful, but because it endured in a world defined by instability. Wood rotted, mud brick eroded, and memory faded, but stone resisted time in a way that aligned with the Egyptian desire for continuity beyond a single lifetime. The decision to build in stone was therefore never merely architectural. It was ideological. To commit labor, resources, and organization to stone construction was to declare that something deserved to exist beyond the present generation. This impulse is most visible in funerary architecture, where the need for endurance was strongest. The body decayed, and even a preserved body could be damaged, but a structure built from limestone or granite offered a form of stability that flesh could not provide. Stone could protect names, images, and ritual spaces long after the living caretakers were gone. Early tombs were modest, often simple mastabas built close to settlements, but over time they became increasingly elaborate as the logic of preservation expanded. A tomb was no longer just a place of burial. It was a functional structure designed to support the continued existence of the deceased within an ordered universe. This belief required careful planning. A tomb had to be positioned correctly, oriented in relation to cardinal directions, and constructed with materials that would resist collapse and intrusion. The western bank of the Nile became the preferred location for these structures, aligning the setting sun with the journey into the afterlife. As royal power consolidated, stone construction expanded beyond private tombs into monumental projects that reshaped the landscape itself. The pyramids did not emerge suddenly as symbols of ambition. They were the result of a long process of experimentation driven by a single objective: durability. Each architectural development sought to solve practical problems. How could a structure be built higher without collapsing? How could internal chambers be protected from pressure and intrusion? How could a king's name survive long after political memory had faded? The answers were found not in decoration, but in engineering. Angles were adjusted, internal spaces simplified, and materials selected for strength rather than ease of transport. The result was a form that emphasized mass and stability over complexity. To the modern observer, these structures appear excessive. To the Egyptians, they were practical responses to a known problem: the impermanence of human life. If the king was responsible for maintaining order, then his continued existence after death mattered. Stone allowed that responsibility to extend beyond breath. The labor required to construct these monuments was immense, but it was not understood as meaningless suffering. Work on royal projects was seasonal, often conducted when the fields were flooded and agricultural labor was limited. Participation in state construction tied individuals to the broader system of order that sustained them. Organization mattered more than speed. Stone blocks were quarried, transported, shaped, and placed according to plans that emphasized precision and repetition. Mistakes could compromise an entire structure, so caution governed every stage of construction. This focus on accuracy extended into the symbolic realm. Reliefs carved into stone walls depicted the deceased in idealized form, frozen in activities that defined status and identity. These images were not artistic expressions. They were functional representations meant to sustain the individual's role in the afterlife. Inscriptions reinforced this function. Names, titles, and offerings were carved deeply to resist erosion, because to preserve a name was to preserve existence. A damaged inscription threatened more than memory. It threatened continuity. Stone also introduced a new vulnerability. Its permanence attracted attention. Tombs became targets for those seeking valuables rather than order. The same durability that preserved structures made them visible across generations. This risk shaped architectural responses. Entrances were concealed, corridors angled, and chambers sealed in ways designed to confuse intruders. Protection became part of the design process, reflecting the understanding that permanence required defense. Over time, even the largest monuments could not guarantee security. Stone endured, but human intention did not always survive intact. Names were erased, faces defaced, and tombs repurposed. Yet the broader logic remained intact. Stone continued to represent resistance against forgetting, even when that resistance was imperfect. A damaged monument still outlasted a life. Beyond tombs, stone architecture reinforced state ideology. Temples, pylons, and obelisks declared the presence of authority in physical form. They transformed belief into environment. To move through a stone-built space was to be reminded of scale. Human bodies appeared small in comparison to walls designed to outlast generations. This imbalance reinforced hierarchy without requiring explanation. Stone taught submission quietly. At the same time, it offered reassurance. In a world where floods erased boundaries and dynasties could collapse, stone suggested that something remained fixed. Even when rulers changed, the structures they left behind continued to shape experience. This continuity mattered deeply to a culture oriented toward order. Stone bridged the gap between past and present by refusing to disappear. It carried memory forward without interpretation. For the individual, this offered a form of hope. A life could end, but its imprint might remain. Not through legacy as later cultures imagined it, but through presence. Stone did not promise immortality. It promised duration. And in ancient Egypt, duration was enough. The necropolises of ancient Egypt were not conceived as isolated burial grounds but as structured extensions of the living world, arranged according to principles that mirrored settlement, hierarchy, and order. They were cities in function if not in population, designed to house the dead in a manner consistent with the social and cosmic structures that had governed their lives. These cities of the dead developed primarily along the western bank of the Nile, where the sun set each evening and disappeared below the horizon. This daily movement provided a natural metaphor for death, linking the physical direction of burial with the transition from life into the afterlife. The choice of location was therefore not symbolic alone, but practical, reinforcing a worldview in which geography, theology, and ritual aligned. Necropolises were carefully organized spaces. Royal tombs occupied dominant positions, often separated from those of officials and laborers by distance, elevation, or architectural scale. This spatial hierarchy preserved social distinctions beyond death, reflecting the belief that order did not end with burial. private tombs clustered around centers of power, particularly near royal complexes or major temples. Proximity mattered. To be buried close to authority was to remain connected to the structures that sustained order in life. The construction of a tomb within a necropolis was a deliberate act of placement rather than a simple response to death. Individuals often prepared their burial sites years or decades in advance, integrating them into long-term plans that accounted for status, family, and available resources. Death was expected, and preparation for it was considered a responsible extension of life. These tombs were not sealed spaces intended to be forgotten. They were designed to be visited. Offering chapels allowed the living to bring food, drink, and ritual attention to the dead, reinforcing relationships that continued after burial. The city of the dead depended on the living. Without regular offerings, names faded and identities weakened. Memory required maintenance, just as fields and canals did. Walls within tombs depicted scenes of daily activity rather than moments of death. Agriculture, craftwork, and administration appeared repeatedly, not as decoration, but as functional imagery intended to sustain the deceased in the afterlife. These images preserved roles rather than experiences, ensuring continuity of identity rather than comfort. The necropolis was also a place of labor. Stonecutters, artisans, painters, and scribes worked continuously to expand and maintain these landscapes of the dead. Their presence reinforced the understanding that death was not a conclusion but a transition requiring ongoing effort. Over time, these burial landscapes grew dense. Older tombs were surrounded by newer ones, creating layers of memory and occupation that reflected generations of social continuity. The dead accumulated much like the living population had along the Nile. Security was a constant concern. Valuables placed within tombs attracted attention, and necropolises became sites of both reverence and violation. Protective inscriptions, false doors, and architectural complexity sought to defend against intrusion, but none offered absolute protection. Despite these risks, burial goods remained essential. Tools, furniture, and provisions were included not to display wealth, but to ensure functionality in the afterlife. The dead were expected to work, eat, and exist within an ordered system similar to that of the living. The city of the dead, therefore, reflected a pragmatic view of eternity. The afterlife was not imagined as a place of reward or escape, but as a continuation governed by familiar structures. Order persisted because it had to. Necropolises also reinforced political authority. Royal tombs anchored legitimacy, linking current rule to ancestral continuity. To maintain the tombs of predecessors was to acknowledge the durability of the system itself. Even periods of instability did not erase this logic. Though resources diminished and tomb construction slowed, the underlying belief in an ordered afterlife remained intact. When stability returned, burial practices resumed with familiar forms. The city of the dead was therefore not a space of despair. It was a managed environment shaped by expectation rather than fear. Death was integrated into the landscape, not removed from it. By walking through a necropolis, one moved through layers of time rather than endings. The presence of the dead reinforced continuity, reminding the living that order extended beyond individual lives. In ancient Egypt, the boundary between the living city and the city of the dead was narrow. Both required maintenance. Both depended on memory. And both existed to preserve order against the slow erosion of time. Embalming in ancient Egypt was not a symbolic gesture toward eternity but a practical response to a specific problem: the instability of the human body after death. Without intervention, decay began quickly, and decay threatened the continued existence of the individual within an ordered universe. Preservation was therefore not optional. It was a requirement. The Egyptians did not believe that the soul could exist independently of the body in a permanent way. Multiple components of identity were understood to depend on physical integrity, and if the body failed, these elements risked dissolution. Embalming was the process by which this risk was managed. This work was carried out by specialists whose role combined technical knowledge with ritual obligation. They were not priests in the conventional sense, but they operated within a framework governed by religious law and expectation. Their actions were precise, repeated, and regulated, because error carried consequences beyond the visible world. The process began shortly after death. Time mattered. The longer the body remained untreated, the more difficult preservation became. Speed, however, was always secondary to accuracy. Internal organs were removed to slow decomposition, a procedure that required both anatomical knowledge and controlled handling. The brain was extracted through the nasal cavity, not because it was considered unimportant, but because it decayed rapidly and could not be preserved effectively. The heart, by contrast, was usually left in place. This decision reflected belief rather than ignorance. The heart was understood as the center of thought, intention, and moral memory. It would later be weighed in judgment, and its absence would undermine the individual's ability to account for their life. The removed organs were treated separately. They were dried, wrapped, and placed in containers designed to protect them from damage. These vessels were not decorative additions but functional safeguards, ensuring that no part of the body was entirely abandoned. Once emptied, the body was dried using natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture that absorbed moisture. This stage lasted weeks rather than days. During this time, the body changed gradually, losing weight and flexibility as fluids were drawn out. The waiting itself was significant. Preservation could not be rushed without compromising effectiveness. Patience was part of the discipline. After drying, the body was cleaned and treated with oils and resins intended to stabilize tissue and create a barrier against decay. These substances also carried ritual meaning, linking the physical process of preservation to divine association. The body was no longer treated as a corpse. It was treated as a vessel. Wrapping followed. Layers of linen were applied methodically, often accompanied by amulets placed at specific points. These objects were not added for ornament. They served protective and functional purposes within the afterlife framework. The completed form was rigid, sealed, and transformed. What had once been vulnerable flesh now approximated the durability of stone or wood. The goal was not realism. It was continuity. Embalming also introduced social distinction. The quality of preservation depended on resources, time, and access to skilled practitioners. Elaborate procedures were available to the elite, while simpler methods were employed for those of lesser means. Despite these differences, the underlying purpose remained consistent. Every preserved body represented an attempt to resist erasure. The method varied. The intention did not. The embalming workshop itself existed at the edge of settlement and cemetery. It was a transitional space, neither fully within the world of the living nor entirely separated from the realm of the dead. Those who worked there occupied a similar position. They handled death daily, but not casually. Their work was regulated, repetitive, and bounded by tradition. Familiarity did not remove caution. Once completed, the preserved body was returned to the family for burial. From that point onward, its survival depended on the integrity of the tomb, the accuracy of ritual, and the continuation of memory. Embalming secured the first requirement. It did not guarantee the others. In this way, preservation was only the beginning. The body was stabilized, but existence still depended on an ordered system extending beyond flesh. Embalming did not promise immortality. It promised the possibility of endurance. And in ancient Egypt, that possibility justified the effort. The afterlife in ancient Egypt was not imagined as a realm of rest granted automatically at death, but as a continuation that demanded justification. Existence beyond the grave required proof that the individual had lived in accordance with order, and that proof was not assumed simply because burial had been completed correctly. The journey of the dead was believed to lead into the Duat, a realm neither wholly separate from the world of the living nor easily accessible. It was structured, governed, and regulated, much like Egypt itself, and those who entered it were subject to examination rather than welcome. Central to this process was judgment. The dead did not face arbitrary punishment or reward, but evaluation. Their continued existence depended on whether their life aligned with Ma'at, the principle that governed truth, balance, and correct action. This judgment was not emotional. It was procedural. The deceased was expected to demonstrate alignment with order through declaration and evidence, not through plea or repentance. Funerary texts provided guidance for this moment. They outlined what was to be said, how one was to present oneself, and which dangers lay ahead. These texts were not prayers in the modern sense, but instructions intended to ensure proper navigation of a regulated system. At the center of judgment stood the weighing of the heart. The heart, preserved within the body, represented intention, memory, and moral conduct. It was placed on a scale opposite the feather of Ma'at, an object that symbolized balance rather than virtue. This act did not measure belief. It measured alignment. A heart heavier than the feather indicated imbalance, not sin. If imbalance was found, the consequence was final. The individual was not punished eternally. They were erased. The devourer, a composite being representing destruction rather than justice, consumed the failed heart, ending existence completely. There was no return, no suffering beyond that moment, and no further judgment. This possibility made judgment absolute. Failure did not lead to torment. It led to non-being. For those who passed the weighing, the afterlife did not become effortless. Order continued. The justified dead were expected to work, to serve, and to participate in a structured existence that mirrored the living world. Fields awaited cultivation. Tasks awaited completion. Roles remained intact. The reward was not leisure. It was continuity. This vision of the afterlife reinforced values held in life. Work was not a punishment but a condition of order. Participation maintained balance. The presence of gods within the underworld reflected function rather than moral authority. Osiris presided not as a judge who condemned, but as a guarantor of continuity. His role was to ensure that the system functioned as intended. Other deities served as guides, guardians, or enforcers of boundaries. Each fulfilled a specific role within a larger structure. None acted independently of Ma'at. Danger still existed within the Duat. Monsters, obstacles, and hostile regions represented forces that resisted order. These were not moral tests, but structural ones, requiring knowledge and preparation rather than courage. Funerary texts equipped the dead with names, phrases, and instructions to pass these obstacles. Knowledge functioned as protection. Ignorance increased risk. This emphasis on preparation explains the importance of correct burial practices and textual accuracy. A mistake in inscription or omission of a name could compromise the entire process. Order extended into language itself. The trials of the underworld reflected Egyptian assumptions about existence. Life was not judged by intention alone, but by its effect on balance. The same principle applied after death. Survival required conformity to structure. Freedom had limits. Deviation carried consequences. In this way, the afterlife was not an escape from the demands of the world. It was their continuation under stricter conditions. The promise offered by Egyptian belief was not salvation. It was endurance. Existence could continue, but only if order had been respected while breath still remained. No funerary structure in ancient Egypt, regardless of its scale or sophistication, could guarantee permanent protection against either time or human intervention. The same architectural choices that were intended to preserve identity and continuity also made tombs visible across generations, and visibility inevitably attracted attention from those who no longer shared the original purpose of these spaces. Tomb robbery was therefore not an exceptional deviation from Egyptian burial practice, but a recurring consequence of it. Grave goods were included to ensure the functionality of the deceased in the afterlife, yet their presence created a persistent tension between ritual intention and material temptation that no society dependent on valuable objects could fully resolve. This problem intensified during periods of political instability, when centralized authority weakened and oversight of necropolises declined. Guarding burial grounds required organization, resources, and regular payment, all of which became unreliable when administrations fractured or priorities shifted. In such circumstances, the distinction between protector and violator often blurred, as individuals responsible for maintaining order were drawn into its erosion. Surviving records indicate that Egyptian responses to tomb robbery were largely administrative rather than moral in character. Investigations focused on the recovery of goods, the restoration of ritual order, and the re-establishment of authority, rather than on expressions of sacrilege or outrage. The primary concern was disruption of continuity, not offense against belief. A violated tomb threatened the system at multiple levels. Damage to inscriptions, images, or burial arrangements weakened the mechanisms through which identity was maintained after death, and without those mechanisms, the deceased risked gradual erasure from the ordered structure of existence. Loss of material wealth was secondary to the loss of function. Architectural responses evolved accordingly. Entrances were concealed more carefully, passageways redirected, and burial chambers positioned deeper within bedrock or beneath increasingly complex layers of stone. These measures were not intended to make tombs inaccessible forever, but to delay intrusion long enough for ritual continuity to be established. Despite these efforts, long-term security remained elusive. Stone could resist erosion and slow entry, but it could not prevent determined access indefinitely, particularly when the original caretakers of a tomb were no longer present to maintain its protection. Over time, many burial sites were opened, stripped of portable goods, and left structurally intact but functionally compromised. The desert itself contributed to this process in contradictory ways. Shifting sand could seal entrances and preserve structures for centuries, yet it could also obscure paths, erase surface markers, and remove tombs from active memory. Once forgotten, a tomb lost not only protection, but relevance. Memory required participation. Offerings had to be brought, names spoken, and rituals repeated if identity was to remain intact. When these actions ceased, continuity weakened regardless of how well the physical structure survived. Political change introduced an additional layer of vulnerability. During periods of dynastic transition or contested legitimacy, monuments associated with former rulers could become targets of deliberate alteration. These actions were not spontaneous acts of destruction, but calculated interventions intended to interrupt continuity and reshape historical presence. Names were removed or altered, facial features damaged, and inscriptions modified or erased in order to detach individuals from the ongoing structure of time and authority. Such interventions were rare, but when they occurred, their effect was profound, because they attacked function rather than material. A tomb deprived of its identifying elements could no longer sustain the individual it was built to preserve. Stone endured, but purpose collapsed. Even so, the broader system adapted rather than dissolving. Burial practices continued, preservation techniques remained in use, and the logic of ordered afterlife persisted despite repeated violations. The goal was never absolute permanence, but extended endurance. Most tombs eventually passed into obscurity through gradual neglect rather than sudden destruction. Sand accumulated around structures no longer visited, entrances disappeared beneath shifting terrain, and what remained was architecture stripped of active voice. This outcome was neither unexpected nor entirely feared. Egyptian belief did not require that every individual be remembered forever. It required that order function effectively for as long as possible. Silence, when it arrived, was understood as a natural conclusion rather than a failure. The erosion of memory was therefore slow and procedural. Attention withdrew first, followed by ritual, and finally by recognition. What remained was landscape rather than presence. In this way, the desert reclaimed what order could delay but never fully defeat. Sand settled, structures endured without function, and the city of the dead gradually merged back into the environment from which it had been carved. The history of ancient Egypt is often presented as a sequence of stable dynasties separated by moments of collapse, but to those who lived through these transitions, decline was rarely sudden or clearly defined. Change usually arrived gradually, through administrative strain, economic imbalance, and the slow weakening of authority rather than through dramatic overthrow. Dynasties faded when their ability to maintain order diminished. This failure was not measured by ideology or belief, but by practical outcomes such as food distribution, internal security, and the reliability of state institutions. When these systems faltered, confidence in leadership weakened, and continuity began to erode. Environmental pressure played a significant role in this process. Extended periods of low Nile inundation reduced agricultural yield, strained storage systems, and increased dependence on redistribution managed by the state. When resources became insufficient, social tension rose and loyalty became conditional. Political fragmentation often followed. Regional officials gained autonomy as central oversight declined, and authority that had once flowed from the royal court became localized. This shift did not immediately dismantle the system, but it altered how power was exercised and perceived. In such periods, the pharaoh's role as guarantor of Ma'at was questioned implicitly rather than openly. Ritual continued, titles were maintained, and monuments remained standing, yet the practical effects of kingship weakened. Order existed in form, but not always in function. These transitions are visible in administrative records and material culture. Construction projects slowed or halted, inscriptions became less elaborate, and regional styles replaced centralized uniformity. Such changes reflected adaptation rather than collapse, as local authorities assumed responsibilities previously managed by the state. Foreign influence also became more pronounced during periods of dynastic decline. Trade partners evolved into power brokers, and external groups settled within Egyptian territory, sometimes peacefully and sometimes by force. Their presence altered political balance without immediately displacing existing structures. Despite these pressures, Egyptian society demonstrated remarkable resilience. Administrative practices persisted, religious rituals continued, and cultural forms adapted to new conditions rather than disappearing. Continuity was preserved through modification rather than resistance. When new dynasties emerged, they rarely rejected the past outright. Instead, they claimed legitimacy by restoring or reaffirming earlier traditions, presenting themselves as renewals of order rather than replacements. This strategy reflected the deep cultural preference for continuity over innovation. Periods of fragmentation were therefore not understood as failures of belief, but as disruptions in administration and resource management. The concept of Ma'at remained intact even when its enforcement weakened, serving as a reference point for restoration rather than a relic of a lost era. The end of a dynasty did not signal the end of Egyptian civilization. Language, ritual, and social organization persisted across centuries of political change, adapting to new rulers while retaining familiar forms. What faded was not identity, but centralized control. This pattern repeated multiple times throughout Egyptian history. Unity dissolved, order adjusted, and authority reassembled in new configurations that drew upon existing cultural framework. Stability was interrupted, but rarely abandoned. In this sense, decline functioned as a process rather than an event. Dynasties faded when they could no longer sustain the practical conditions required for order, and they were replaced when new structures proved capable of doing so. The cycle reflected pragmatism rather than inevitability. For those living through these transitions, uncertainty became a defining condition. Loyalty shifted toward local institutions, daily survival took precedence over ideology, and long-term continuity depended on adaptation rather than certainty. Yet even in periods of fragmentation, the fundamental assumptions of Egyptian society remained intact. Order was still valued, memory still mattered, and stability remained the ultimate measure of success. When dynasties faded, Egypt did not disappear. It changed shape, redistributed authority, and waited for conditions that allowed order to be reasserted. Ancient Egypt endured not because it was timeless, but because it developed systems capable of managing instability across generations. Its environment offered little margin for error, and survival depended on continuous adjustment rather than confidence, making order a practical necessity rather than a philosophical ideal. Life along the Nile required attention, restraint, and acceptance of limits that could not be negotiated away. The river dictated agricultural success, political stability, and social cohesion, while the desert imposed boundaries that reminded every community of how narrow the space for life truly was. Within this constrained landscape, permanence was never assumed, only pursued. Egyptian society responded to this reality by embedding order into every layer of existence. Administration measured resources, religion regulated uncertainty, and architecture sought durability in a world where both memory and material decayed. Even death was integrated into this structure, treated not as an ending, but as a condition that required management. The afterlife promised continuity, but only under strict conditions. Preservation demanded preparation, judgment required alignment, and existence beyond death depended on the successful maintenance of systems established while alive. Nothing was automatic and nothing was guaranteed. Power in ancient Egypt was justified not by innovation or conquest, but by the ability to sustain balance. Kings ruled as long as order functioned, and dynasties faded when administration, resources, or authority failed to meet practical demands. Change was tolerated only insofar as it restored stability rather than disrupted it. For ordinary people, life unfolded within boundaries defined by tradition, hierarchy, and necessity. Security depended on participation rather than resistance, and survival required acceptance of roles that limited freedom in exchange for predictability. The system offered endurance, but at the cost of autonomy. Across centuries, this approach proved effective. Egypt adapted to environmental pressure, political fragmentation, and external influence without abandoning its core assumptions about order, memory, and continuity. What endured was not a single state, but a way of structuring existence under constant constraint. Yet this endurance was never complete. Tombs were violated, names erased, and systems weakened despite careful design. The effort to preserve order delayed erasure, but it could not prevent it indefinitely. In this sense, ancient Egypt offers neither a warning nor an ideal. It presents a record of how one civilization responded to uncertainty with structure, and how that structure sustained life while simultaneously limiting it. The question it leaves behind is not whether the system succeeded, but what it demanded from those who lived within it. Order required vigilance, conformity, and acceptance of limits that few modern societies would tolerate. And so, as the monuments remain and the river continues its course, one final question persists. Not as poetry, but as assessment. Would you have survived in this era? Ancient Egypt did not promise comfort, freedom, or certainty. It offered continuity through discipline, stability through restraint, and meaning through alignment with forces that could never be fully controlled. Its legacy endures not because it was gentle, but because it understood the cost of survival. Thank you for traveling with me. May the echoes of the past carry you into a peaceful sleep.